Dawn had not yet dried the thin veil of mist on the marble steps. The county courthouse stood there, imposing, cold, like a fortress of the law. But that morning, the very place built to protect justice became the place where justice was trampled. Justice Morgan, 38, approached with a simple air. No judge's robe, no retinue. Just a black woman in a grey coat, cradling a leather briefcase heavy with files. Every step was firm, the step of someone accustomed to deciding the fate of others. But on the high steps, a figure blocked her way. Security Officer Coleman. His eyes were contemptuous, a mocking smile pulling his face askew. Gutter trash from the projects, your kind belongs in cages, not walking into a courthouse, he growled, each word slicing the air like a blade. Justice stopped short. She had no time to pull out her badge or say who she was. A brutal hand lashed across. The dry crack of a slap split the peaceful morning. Her head jerked to the side, her mouth filled with the taste of blood. The leather briefcase slipped from her hand. Thick case files burst out, riding the wind like scraps, documents stamped with the court seal now rolling under the feet of passers-by. Each page that fell was an insult, the law torn to pieces by the very man charged with defending it. Coleman did not stop. He seized her by the throat and slammed her against the cold wall. A metallic clatter rang out, handcuffs clamped tight around her wrists. This is where you belong, in chains. Other officers gathered. No one intervened. They stood there, arms crossed, smirking. A few even pulled out their phones to record, as if this were merely some morning amusement. There was no solemnity of the law in their eyes, only the cruel pleasure of those who believe they hold the power over life and death. Justice Morgan did not cry out. She lifted her face, dark eyes full of endurance and fury. Her gaze passed beyond the crowd toward the heavy wooden doors ahead. High above, a gleaming brass plate caught the first light of day. The Honorable Justice M. Morgan, presiding judge, only 20 steps away. Her name, her title, the justice she served, glittered above her head. Yet at her feet, she stood cuffed, humiliated like someone with no name, no rights. In that moment, the naked truth emerged. Her skin color mattered more than anything. It obscured her degrees, her robe, her 2 decades of service to the law. In their eyes, she was not a judge. She was merely a black who dared to step where she did not belong, and on those cold stone steps, justice was the first thing pushed down. Inside Courtroom 4, golden light from the chandeliers glittered down onto rows of wooden benches lined up in neat order. Everything here radiated the solemnity of the law. But that morning, that solemnity was nothing more than a mask, concealing a vile play being staged. Coleman entered like a victor. He smoothed his uniform lapels, straightened the polished nameplate on his chest, and strode proudly to the witness stand. Before him sat acting Judge Harold Green, a white man in his 60s, long-faced and cold, his eyes drifting as though this script had been familiar to him for years. To the right, Prosecutor Martha Lewis, a middle-aged blonde woman, nodded at Coleman with trusting approval. The whole courtroom seemed poised to hear what they wanted to believe, the familiar tale of a troublesome person of color arrested by due process. Justice Morgan was dragged in last. Her wrists still bore the angry red marks of the cuffs. Her left cheek was swollen, dried blood clinging to the corner of her mouth. She was forced into the wooden defendant's chair, hands set on the table as though she truly were a criminal. Whispers rippled through the gallery. Look at her, dressed so sloppily, daring to carry stolen documents. They're always like this, pretending, always playing the victim. Each murmur was a needle piercing her pride. Coleman began. His voice was low and steady, practiced by dozens, hundreds of lies. Your Honor Green, at approximately 8:47 this morning, I observed a suspicious individual attempting to enter a restricted area of the courthouse. This person was dressed inappropriately and carrying a briefcase containing documents that appeared stolen. He paused, glancing toward Justice Morgan like a predator eyeing bound prey. The individual was uncooperative, shouting profanities, and turned violent when I asked for identification. Martha Lewis nodded, jotting notes quickly as though his every word were true. "Officer," she asked, "how exactly did she threaten you?" Coleman did not hesitate. "She screamed that she was important, that she would get us fired, then tried to flee. I was forced to use minimal restraint to ensure the safety of the courthouse." From the public benches, two other officers, Rodriguez and Thompson, sat quietly, exchanging complicit glances. They had heard this script many times before. Different names, different faces, but the lines were the same. Rodriguez nodded, ready to bolster the testimony. Thompson folded his arms, his lips curling in a faint smile of one who knew the truth, but chose silence. Green leaned back in his chair, his face stern but satisfied. So the subject resisted, used abusive language, and carried suspicious documents. "Yes, Your Honor," Coleman answered, his tone sweet as honey. Every eye in the courtroom turned to Justice. Some shook their heads. Shameful, causing trouble here. Others sighed, typical, always blaming racism. No one questioned how a woman with a swollen face and wrists scarred by cuffs could have attacked a burly officer. Justice Morgan remained still, her hands folded together, eyes fixed on the national emblem above the wall. In those eyes there was no panic, only a smoldering flame, silent yet unyielding. Prosecutor Lewis stepped forward. "We propose charging the subject with 3 counts: unlawful trespass, resisting an officer, and assaulting a police officer." The courtroom nodded as one. Everything was too familiar. A black woman was turned into a criminal by a few words from an officer. Coleman pressed on, his voice swelling with false indignation. "Your Honor, I have served for 15 years. I've seen countless individuals like her, always hiding behind claims of racism to excuse their misconduct. That insults the true victims of racism." He stressed the words "true victims," prompting subtle nods around the room. A cunning trick, turning truth into a ploy, turning the victim into the liar. Rodriguez was called to the stand. "Yes, I witnessed everything." The subject shouted, raised her voice, and deliberately crossed into a restricted area. Officer Coleman handled it very professionally. Thompson followed, his gaze ice cold. "Your Honor, I also suspect she is involved in document fraud. Those files show signs of forgery." Whispers swelled again. "Fraud, forgery, exactly the type." The crowd murmured in chorus, as if justice were decided by popular vote. In the defendant's chair, Justice Morgan drew a deep breath. Each word they spoke weighed like stones on her chest. But she stayed silent. Because silence now was not weakness. Silence was to be observed, to record every word, every detail, every face. Truth does not need to shout, it only requires the right moment to thunder. Judge Green propped his chin and turned toward Justice. "Does the defendant have anything to say?" In an instant, the room froze, waiting for a clumsy defense or a burst of emotion. Justice Morgan lifted her head, her voice low and calm. "Your Honor, before I answer any questions, I request only one thing, that all security footage from this morning be preserved, along with the body cam data from Officer Coleman and his colleagues. Every single file." Her words rang out, clear, each syllable metallic. Prosecutor Lewis jumped up in protest. "The defendant has no right to such a request without legal counsel." But Green frowned, silent. He knew the request was entirely constitutional. Coleman's face shifted, He turned away, feigning deafness. Rodriguez and Thompson traded uneasy glances. They knew once the cameras were opened, this entire play would collapse. The room fell still for a few seconds. Then Coleman's mocking laugh shattered the quiet. Here we go again, the victim act, always the same. When caught, they cry for cameras, cry for justice. Your Honor, I've seen this script too many times. Justice Morgan did not respond. She only met his eyes. No hatred, no pleading. Just the gaze of someone who knew the actual day of reckoning was close. Outside, the first rays of sunlight filtered through the windows, falling across the wooden table where she sat. That fragile light revealed her bruises more clearly than ever. A living piece of evidence, needing no documents, no testimony. Only the eyes of a woman who had endured too much injustice. The courtroom seemed split in two. One half clung to the familiar lie. The other began to sense the strangeness of her silence. And in that very moment, an undercurrent of fury began to stir. Not loud, not chaotic, but waiting to erupt, needing only a spark, a single piece of truth to burn down the entire play Coleman had staged. The ceiling fan turned slowly above, its dull hum beating against the ears. Courtroom 4 was suffocatingly silent, broken only by the clerk's pen tapping across the desk, transcribing every false word Coleman had uttered. Each line, once written down, would become the official record, evidence the legal system valued more than the living truth before its eyes. Justice Morgan sat still in the defendant's chair. Her wrists throbbed from the raw grooves left by steel cuffs. Her forehead ached where Coleman's brutal hand had struck. The metallic tang of blood still lingered at the corner of her lips. But she forced it all down, burying the pain beneath a mask of calm. Acting Judge Harold Green tapped his gavel lightly. "That will do, Officer Coleman. I believe your testimony is clear. Now, the defendant will have the opportunity to speak. An opportunity." It sounded like a favor granted to a lesser being. But for Justice Morgan, this was no favor. This was her constitutional right, and she would wield it with the precision of someone who had devoted her life to the law. She rose to her feet. The wooden chair creaked sharply in the silence of the chamber. Every gaze turned toward her. A few were already poised to sneer, waiting for a clumsy, emotional plea they could dismiss with smug disdain. "Your Honor," her voice was low, steady, each word heavy as stone dropping onto the table. "There are too many falsehoods in the testimony just given. I never—" "Enough!" Green cut her off, his voice icy. "Defendant, this is not the place for lectures or political theater. If you wish to object, be brief and stay on point. Do not drag race into this." The gallery erupted in whispers of approval. "That's right, playing the victim again. Always the same. Every problem blamed on racism. Soft laughter, weary sighs as though the verdict had already been written." Justice clenched her fists. But she did not scream. She did not hurl futile accusations. She knew, in a room blinded by prejudice, steadfastness and intellect were her only weapons. She opened the case file that had been tossed back onto the evidence table, her voice calm yet firm. "Your Honor, I request that all courthouse security footage from 8:45 to 9:05 this morning be preserved. That includes exterior cameras, the main entrance, and the body cameras of every officer present." A wave of murmurs rose like surf. Lewis, the prosecutor, shot up. "Objection, Your Honor. The defendant has no legal standing to make such a demand. She is simply stalling." Green frowned, striking his gavel. "Objection noted. The request is denied. Proceed." Coleman broke into mocking laughter, his voice echoing across the chamber. Familiar, always the same. The moment they're caught, they cry for cameras, cry for evidence, cry for justice. But it's all just an act of evasion. He turned toward the gallery, searching for support, and found it. Many nodded, as though they'd heard this very line repeated 100 times on television. Justice lifted her head, locking eyes with Green. Her voice was not loud, but it rang with finality. Your Honor, under Brady v. Maryland, the prosecution is obligated to preserve and disclose all evidence that may exonerate the accused. To ignore this request is a direct violation of constitutional rights. For a few moments, the courtroom fell silent. A young stenographer stopped typing, raising her eyes to Justice in bewilderment. Clearly, this was no emotional outburst. This was the cadence of someone who knew the law, indeed, the cadence of a seasoned attorney. Green coughed, scrambling to reclaim authority. She may have plucked a few case names off the internet. Don't be distracted. Continue with the prosecution. From the back, Rodriguez smirked and whispered to Thompson. She knows the law too well. Do you think she really is who she says? Thompson shook his head, muttering, What does it matter? We stick to Coleman's story. But his voice trembled, the first crack in their wall of lies. Justice went on, and regarding the documents they accuse me of stealing, she pointed to the pile scattered across the evidence table. These are case files for Peterson v. State, today's docket schedule, and internal memoranda bearing the court's seal. Such documents, Your Honor, can only be issued to authorized court personnel. Green cut her off hastily. That's enough. You will not manipulate this court with unsubstantiated claims. Coleman sneered, stepping forward, arms folded. You hear that? She's back to claiming importance, insisting she has the right to confidential files. Sounds to me like someone impersonating court staff to steal information. Mocking laughter swelled again. The gallery became a chorus, echoing lies as though they were truth. But Justice remained unmoved, her eyes fixed on the relief of Lady Justice high above. The scales in the goddess's hand tilted heavily to one side, weighted down with prejudice and fear. For a fleeting moment, memories surged. In her early days on the bench, she had believed that truth, once spoken, would be heavy enough to balance the scales. But this morning, in the very courthouse where she had served for over a decade, she realized truth alone was not enough. It needed defenders. It required those willing to pay the price. She drew a deep breath, preparing to continue, when Green raised his hand and slammed the gavel hard. Silence. If the defendant persists, I will hold her in contempt immediately. The gavel's thunder rolled through the courtroom. The crowd broke into scattered applause, as though applauding the finale of a farce. Coleman curled his lips, stepping closer to the witness stand, leaning toward her ear. You think your voice carries weight here? In this place, your skin has already spoken for you. A chill shot down Justice's spine. Yet in her eyes, instead of fear, a spark ignited. No one in that chamber knew that at that very moment, when they thought her silenced, broken, that was when she began turning the entire game around. For justice, when muzzled, does not die. It quietly withdraws, waiting for the moment to strike, like a blade hidden in its sheath, gleaming the instant it is drawn. And justice knew that moment was very near. ChatGPT Danoi. The sound of Green's gavel had barely faded when an officer led Justice Morgan out of the courtroom. The heavy wooden door shut behind her, sealing off the jeers inside with a dense silence. The corridor stretched long and dim, bathed in pallid fluorescent light, each footstep echoing in harsh, hollow beats. She was brought into a small chamber beside the courtroom, a temporary holding cell for defendants. No windows, only dingy grey-painted walls, a scratched iron table, and a cold metal chair. The air reeked of rust and bleach. It was nothing less than a cage, just as Coleman had spat at her on the courthouse steps. Your kind belongs in cages. The steel door clanged shut, the lock snapping into place. Justice sat down, drawing a long breath to steady her heartbeat. Her head still throbbed, her cheek burned, but inside, a quiet voice rose. "You've endured enough, no more silence." She closed her eyes. The morning replayed like a reel running backward, the scattered files, the slap, the cuffs, the mocking laughter. And above all, the brass plate engraved with her name, Justice M. Morgan, presiding judge. She remembered the bitter sting of seeing it as she stood in chains. Her name hung high, while her body was trampled low. A metallic click broke her thoughts. The guard stepped in. Henderson, the courthouse veteran. He was the one who had bowed to her every morning, who sometimes brought her coffee when she hurried to the bench. Now he froze in place, eyes widening at the bruise on her face. "My God, he whispered. "Justice Morgan?" His throat tightened, his voice trembling. I didn't recognize you. They dragged you off like a criminal. I'm sorry." Justice opened her eyes, her voice hoarse but firm. "You're not the one who needs to apologize, but I need you to do something." "Anything, Your Honor." "Go to my chambers. Bring me the black robe with the gold trim, and the gavel, the one engraved 'Truth will rise.' Bring them here, quietly." Henderson nodded, still stunned. He turned quickly, his hurried steps echoing, as though he feared that a single second's delay could alter history. The door closed again. Silence pressed in. Justice leaned back in the chair, breathing deeply, centering herself. She had learned this practice in her early years on the bench, reclaiming her composure before walking into a difficult trial. But today was different. Today she was the defendant, the one humiliated, the one degraded. And she had only 15 minutes to transform disgrace into a weapon. Her phone had been returned, placed on the table like a discarded trinket. She unlocked it, dozens of missed calls and messages from Janet Morrison, her clerk. "Where are you? The attorney in Peterson has been waiting 30 minutes. Rumors are spreading. Something happened at the entrance. Please call back." Justice typed a quick reply. "Cancel today's docket. There's something more urgent. Prepare the Martinez files, all cases from the last 5 years." She opened her contacts, found the number for Chief Judge Margaret Carter. The line rang, then Carter's urgent voice answered, "The Peterson trial is delayed. Reports say you were—" "Justice, are you all right?" Justice forced down the rage burning in her chest. "I was assaulted by an officer on the courthouse steps, called an animal, and handcuffed before the public. And now he sits inside, perjuring himself about me." Silence on the other end, then Carter's voice hardened. "My God, what do you want me to do?" "Order the preservation of all footage from this morning. Gate cameras, hallway feeds, body cam data. Make multiple copies and store them in separate locations, immediately." "I understand. Justice, you can't preside over this. It's a conflict of interest." "Margaret, in 10 minutes I will walk back into that courtroom, and I will make clear who really carries the conflict here." She ended the call, her grip on the phone whitening her knuckles. Footsteps hurried outside. The door swung open. Henderson appeared, carrying a garment bag and a wooden box. He set them on the table, Basil, his eyes still shadowed with worry. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Justice opened the box, lifting the gavel. White light glinted across the engraved words, "Truth will rise." She gave a faint, dry smile. "I didn't choose this. They left me no choice." Henderson watched as she draped the black robe across her shoulders. The fabric fell heavy, covering the bruise on her cheek, turning it into part of the image, a scar of justice. Each fold of cloth carried the weight of 23 years on the bench. Justice studied herself in the small wall mirror. The beaten, cuffed, humiliated woman from less than half an hour ago was gone. Before her now stood Justice Morgan, Chief Judge of the county, who had delivered thousands of verdicts, sworn to uphold the Constitution. She wrapped her hand around the gavel, its weight steady, unyielding. Every grain of wood reminded her, justice may be struck down, but it never stays down. Henderson asked softly, "How should I address you when we return to court?" Justice drew a deep breath, then answered with quiet resolve. "As every day, the Honorable Justice Morgan presiding." Silence thickened. Henderson straightened, standing at attention like a soldier awaiting orders. Justice gripped the gavel tightly and walked toward the door. The clock on the wall showed exactly 15 minutes since she had been dragged from the courtroom. The iron door opened. Blinding light from the corridor poured in, glinting on the golden trim of her robe. Justice stepped forward, each footfall echoing like war drums heralding the storm about to break. Within her, all pain, all humiliation, all jeers had fused into one thing, a vow pulsing in her blood. Justice will rise, and when it rises, no one will be able to bury it again. The door of courtroom 4 creaked open, slicing through the thick silence like a blade. Hundreds of eyes in the gallery turned at once, and they saw a figure cloaked in heavy black robes, golden trim gleaming under the chandelier. Justice Morgan. Each of her steps echoed across the wooden floor, slow, deliberate, resounding like the ancient drumbeat of judgment. No longer did she resemble a battered defendant. Before them stood authority itself, a judge entering the very court she once presided over. Henderson stood at the door, his voice booming deep and resonant. "All rise, the Honorable Justice Morgan presiding." The words crashed into the chamber like an iron hammer. People rose instinctively, some not yet understanding what was happening. Wooden benches screeched, feet shuffled until the whole courtroom stood frozen like statues. On the bench, acting Judge Harold Green went pale. Still seated in the presider's chair, his hands trembled. For a fleeting moment, he looked like an intruder, caught in another's home. He lurched to his feet, stammering, I didn't know." Justice Morgan halted just below the bench, her gaze calm but cold as steel. "Thank you for standing in temporarily. From here I will take over myself." Green bowed his head and stepped down, his robe trailing with each unsteady step, as though chased by an invisible storm. The gallery was stunned. Coleman, leaning against the prosecutor's table, went rigid. He blinked rapidly, face blanching, lips trembling. The officer who had slapped her, cuffed her on the courthouse steps, was now forced to watch his victim ascend the bench, gavel in hand, its engraving gleaming. Truth will rise. Justice Morgan turned, her gaze sweeping the room. All the whispers, all the mocking laughter dissolved into a dreadful silence. No one dared breathe too loudly. They no longer saw a humiliated black woman. They saw the embodiment of justice, alive, breathing, staring directly at them. She sat in her rightful chair. The wood creaked, as though exhaling relief at the return of its actual occupant. Her robe draped down, the bruise on her cheek exposed under the light, not as a mark of shame, but as living proof of the crime committed that morning. She lifted the gavel and struck it once. Bang! The sound rolled through the chamber, thudding into every chest. "This trial," her voice rang out, low and steady, "will continue, but not as you imagined. From this moment, I, Justice Morgan, will preside." Coleman swallowed hard, then forced himself into defiance. What is this? A farce? You can't be both the defendant and the judge." The courtroom held its breath. Justice Morgan leaned forward, eyes sharp, her voice low but cutting and clear. "You are correct in one respect, Officer Coleman. I cannot be a defendant in a case built on lies while the real evidence waits outside to be revealed. And I most certainly can be the judge to expose those lies, right here, right now." Murmurs rose, not with scorn, but with shock and confusion. Rodriguez and Thompson, who had testified in his favor, exchanged uneasy glances, their faces blanching. They understood. the veil had torn. Justice struck the gavel again. "Order!" The sound sliced the air like a blade. The chamber fell into absolute silence. She turned toward Coleman, her tone level but sharp as steel. "Officer Coleman, you will remain exactly where you stand. Every word you uttered this morning, every claim, will be verified immediately." Coleman pressed his lips tight. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple, catching the overhead light like a drop of blood about to fall. The room was taut as wire. Whispers broke out in the gallery. Could it be, she really is the judge? My God, then we just witnessed an officer assaulting his own presiding judge. Justice's gaze swept across each face, the courthouse staff who had sneered, the public who had mocked. Without a word, she forced their heads to bow. Before their eyes, the scales of justice had tipped. The man who had steered the story with lies was now the unspoken defendant. And the black woman once called an animal had returned to the highest seat, her gavel ready to decide his fate. She let the silence stretch, tightening around every heart in the room. Then, in a voice deep and resonant, she declared, "This trial is not about judging an imaginary defendant. This trial is to uncover the truth, who the true offender is in this court today." The gavel struck again. Bang! In that moment, the entire chamber understood. The real storm had only just begun. The air in the courtroom thickened like a cellar starved of oxygen. Every eye was fixed on Justice Morgan, now seated in the highest chair, the place where authority and truth were meant to be named. Coleman stood frozen at the front, sweat pouring, his hands clenched tight as though his whole body might collapse. Justice tapped the wooden gavel lightly. The sound rang sharp and cold. "We will begin with evidence. No word has value without the sight and sound of truth." A murmur rippled through the chamber. Rodriguez glanced at Thompson, whispering shakily, She's going to show something?" Thompson swallowed hard, shaking his head. "God help us. If there really is camera footage..." "We're finished." Justice raised her hand. Henderson stepped forward at once, placing a tablet already connected on the bench. On the screen, white letters appeared. "Courthouse security, camera 7, main entrance." Coleman's heart pounded. In an instant, he remembered what rage had made him forget that morning. The marble steps where he struck Justice Morgan were under surveillance. Justice pressed play. The first sound rang out, cutting the air like a blade. "Filthy ghetto trash. You belong in a cage, not in this courthouse." The chamber froze. Some covered their mouths, eyes wide with horror. It was not a retelling, not a plea. It was Coleman's own voice, snarling, echoing through the courtroom. On the screen, the image was clear. Justice, in her grey coat, holding her leather case, blocked by Coleman. The slap cracked like thunder, the case fell, and papers scattered like broken wings. Then Coleman's hand clamped her throat, slammed her against the wall. The cold metallic click of handcuffs locking tight. A cry broke from the gallery. "My God!" Prosecutor Martha Lewis sat bloodless, head bowed, her trembling hand shielding her notes. Justice paused the video at the moment the cuffs closed on her wrists. She turned toward Coleman, her voice low, edged with steel. "You told this court I resisted, cursed and threatened. Show me, in this footage, where that truth exists." Coleman opened his mouth, but no sound came. The chamber was silent, but for his ragged breathing. Justice pressed play again. Another feed appeared. Body cam, Coleman, auto backup, cloud. The footage shook, but the words were unmistakable. "This bitch thinks she has the right to walk in here. People like her need teaching. Animals must know their place." A furious hiss rose from the gallery. A young black woman shot to her feet, tears streaming. "Oh God, that's the language he's used on us for years." Guards moved to guide her back down, but the truth had already lit the flame. Angry breaths, whispers of outrage surged across the room. Justice cut the video. The chamber sank into heavy silence, every gaze drilling into Coleman's eyes, filled with fury, contempt, disgust. She turned to Rodriguez and Thompson. "You swore under oath that Coleman acted professionally. Do either of you wish to amend your testimony?" Rodriguez dropped his head, lips quivering. Thompson stared at the exit as if ready to flee. Neither spoke. Their silence thundered louder than confession. Justice Morgan rose, gavel in hand. Her voice rang slow and deliberate, every word a chisel into stone. "This is what they call professional. This is what the system trusted all these years. No, this is proof that prejudice has become habit and violence the default language against those with my skin." A soft sob rose from the gallery. An elderly black man, stooped with age, whispered, at last, someone has shown them the truth." Coleman trembled, voice rasping, desperate to recover. "It was just edited. Justice raised her hand, cutting him short. "You claim the courthouse servers and the police department's auto backup system all conspired to edit against you." Coleman choked. The words stuck in his throat, sputtering into a strangled gasp. Justice struck the gavel. Bang. The sound cracked like thunder. "This morning's play of lies is over. The truth has broken through. And when truth appears, darkness has no place left to hide." The courtroom seemed to explode with energy. No more whispers, no more mocking. Only fury, building, waiting to ignite. In that moment, justice was silent no longer. The courtroom felt compressed, as if the air itself had been locked down after the truth blazed across the screen. Coleman staggered, sweat dripping onto the wooden floor in heavy drops, his eyes hollow. People looked at him as though at a criminal unmasked before the entire hall. Justice Morgan sat upright, her robe cascading over the bench like a curtain of night that concealed her bruise. She set the gavel down and slowly opened a thick dossier Henderson had placed on her desk. The sound of turning pages sliced through the silence like thin blades. "We have just seen what happened this morning." Justice's voice rang steady, deep, and cold. "But the truth about Officer Coleman is not contained in a few minutes of camera footage. It stretches back 15 years. She lifted the first page high. Internal Affairs records. In total, 47 formal complaints, 17 allegations of excessive force, 26 allegations of racial slurs, 4 allegations of fabricating evidence. Whispers rippled, swelling like an underground tide. Justice paused, her eyes sweeping the chamber. Each allegation ruled insufficient evidence. A black woman, elderly, burst into tears from the back row. I once filed a complaint against him. He beat my son and called him an animal, and they dismissed it." Her sobs echoed, thickening the air. Justice turned another page, pulled out a large chart, and held it aloft. "This is the statistical record of 1,089 arrests made by Coleman throughout his career." The red pen in her hand tapped each bold number. 87% were people of color, yet in his patrol district only 27% of residents are black. Rodriguez swallowed hard. Thompson turned his face away. No one in the chamber could deny such stark, glaring disparity. Justice pressed on, her voice pounding like hammer blows. Of those arrests, 642 involved reported use of force. Against people of color, 63%. Against white individuals, 12%. A surge of voices erupted. A young lawyer leapt to his feet. "My God, this isn't an error. This is a system of bias maintained for years." Justice slammed the gavel. Bang! The sound snapped the chamber back to order, but the outrage in their eyes could not be hidden. She drew another file, her tone dropping, icy and sharp. And here, the list of dismissed cases. 432 were thrown out for lack of evidence, constitutional violations or procedural abuse. Dismissal rate 40%. She lifted her gaze, locking directly on Coleman. Do you know what they call this? It is not a professional error. It is a pattern of unlawful conduct. Coleman's mouth opened, as if to protest, but the chamber drowned him out with furious cries. 15 years of lies. How many families has he destroyed? Now the net has closed. Justice raised one final sheet, sharp as a verdict. In 15 years, this county has paid $2,300,000 in civil settlements connected to Coleman. Taxpayers' money spent to atone for the crimes of a man in uniform. The chamber erupted. Shouts of rage, fists pounding wooden benches, tears mingling with breaths of fury. For the first time, years of repression found release. Justice Morgan lifted the gavel in her hand, her voice rolling like thunder. This is no longer the story of a single morning. This is the story of an entire system that sheltered lies and trampled justice. But here, today, its mask has fallen. She fixed her gaze on Coleman, each word etched in stone. You told me to know my place. Now remember yours. Your place is at the defendant's stand, facing the justice you once scorned. Bang! The gavel crashed down like thunder announcing a storm that could not be stopped. Coleman could no longer hold on to his usual arrogance. He staggered like a man struck down by a storm, eyes darting for an escape in a courtroom that had turned into an invisible prison. Sweat streamed down his temples, soaking into his collar, making the blue uniform feel unbearably heavy. No, it's not like that, he stammered, voice hoarse. I was doing my duty. I was protecting the court's safety. I never meant. Justice Morgan struck the gavel. Bang. The sound stripped his excuses bare, like dead leaves shaken from a tree. You did not protect safety, she said, her voice hard as steel. You protected your own prejudice. You did not enforce the law. You inflicted harm. The chamber erupted in agreement. A black man, his face carved with the lines of hard labor, shot to his feet and roared, "My son had his teeth broken by him just for asking why he was being stopped. They ignored me. All these years, who will apologize to us?" Applause, sobs, and shouts swelled together. Rodriguez dropped his head. Thompson turned away, eyes frantic, as though the wall of lies around them had crumbled. Justice fixed her gaze on the two, her tone icy. You also swore an oath before this court. Do you wish to correct your testimony or sink with your comrade? No answer came. But their trembling silence was an answer in itself. Coleman rallied for one last attempt. He turned to the crowd, shouting until his voice cracked. They're fabricating this. This is a plot to destroy me. Do you know how many years I sacrificed for this badge? But instead of sympathy, he met only eyes burning with rage. No one saw a guardian of order anymore, only a man who had abused power to trample the vulnerable. Justice rose. Her black robe flowed down, its golden trim gleaming beneath the lights, forming a line between her and Coleman. She raised the gavel high, her voice ringing clear, each word a nail hammered into the coffin of lies. Officer Coleman, from this moment you are no longer a witness. You are no longer an officer of the law. You are the accused of truth, the accused of justice. Coleman collapsed to his knees, hands trembling as they clutched the edge of the table. No, this can't. I will appeal. Justice turned to Henderson. Detain him, here and now. Henderson stepped forward, face stern. In his eyes was no longer respect for a fellow officer, but the cold resolve of a soldier carrying out justice. He pulled out the cuffs and snapped them around Coleman's wrists, the same cuffs Coleman had used that very morning to humiliate justice. The metallic click rang out, echoing through the chamber. A circle is closed, and a moment of justice restored. The courtroom exploded. Thunderous applause, voices crying, "Justice! Justice!" mingled with tears. Many rose to their feet, eyes blazing, as though for the first time in their lives they had seen the oppressor brought low before them. Coleman was dragged toward the back, his face drained of all color. He twisted to look back, desperate. You'll regret this. I am not alone. The system will protect me." Justice gave no reply. She struck the gavel once more, deep and firm. The system will protect justice, not lies. Silence fell again. And in that moment, everyone understood. This was not merely the downfall of one man. It was the beginning of an upheaval, a storm that would sweep away all who had conspired in the shadows. The courtroom door closed behind Coleman, the clinking of his cuffs echoing like a death knell for 15 years of arrogance. In that chamber, they had not merely witnessed a trial, they had seen a turning point. And as the shock spread beyond those walls, it became a wave that could not be stopped. Within hours, the news exploded. The videos shown in court, the slur animal, the slap, the handcuffs, flooded every social network. Each click, each share was another gavel strike against the nation's conscience. People were stunned, enraged, and then rose in unison. If they can do this to a judge, what have they done to ordinary citizens all these years? On television, anchors shed their usual composure. Their voices shook as they read, "A black judge, handcuffed and humiliated on the very steps of the courthouse where she served." Legal experts clashed fiercely, many admitting this was not the failure of one man, but proof of a disease rooted deep in the system. The Department of Justice could not remain silent. Within 24 hours, a special investigation was announced. Arrest records, internal reports, and every case bearing Coleman's name were ordered for review. The FBI arrived carrying clear instructions: leave no evidence unchecked, no testimony ignored. The officers who had folded their arms and laughed as justice was degraded now faced interrogation. Rodriguez and Thompson, who had echoed Coleman's lies, were formally charged with perjury and complicity. Their once jeering laughter, captured on tape, had become their own indictment. The community, long cowed by fear, awoke. In the city's south, crowds filled the square. Placards rose high, "If justice can rise, we can too." Mothers who had wept dry over sons wrongfully jailed stepped forward, telling their stories without trembling. Young men once imprisoned on fabricated charges have now found their names on the list for retrial. For the first time in years, fear had turned into strength. Emergency reforms followed. Chief Judge Margaret Carter signed an order requiring all cases involving allegations of police abuse to be reviewed by independent courts. Body cameras would now have dual backup systems, no more excuses of lost data. Police academies were mandated to add compulsory courses on constitutional rights and racial bias. Curricula drafted by none other than Justice Morgan herself. Across the nation, the image of justice in her black robe, the bruise still visible on her cheek, walking into the courtroom to the words "All rise," became an emblem. They called it the awakening hour. Newspapers wrote, "Justice is no longer a blindfolded statue with scales. Justice has the face of a black woman and her eyes are wide open." Justice Morgan knew the storm was only beginning. But in the eyes of the people, she saw something greater than power: faith. Faith that justice can be choked, can be struck down, but it always finds a way to rise. And this time it rose not just for her, but for all. 6 months had passed since that fateful morning, yet its echoes reverberated across the city. The county courthouse, once the place where Justice Morgan was cuffed and degraded, now bore a new face. At the entrance, on the marble wall, a bronze plaque read, "Every citizen deserves dignity. Moi kong zun deu sungdang ve famza." Fresh flowers were always laid beneath it. People paused, touched the words as if performing a ritual, pledging that deceit would never again bow their heads there. Across the city, Coleman's victims had their names restored. Over 400 tainted cases were reopened, and dozens of people were exonerated. Some returned after 10 years in prison, hair turned grey, still able to collapse into the trembling arms of their mothers. One young man, once jailed for a crime that never existed, walked back into the light, head high as if he had never been broken. Simple reunions, strangled embraces, bitter tears, all became the verdicts of justice long denied. At the same time, the quake spread wider. The officers who had mocked justice were now humiliated and stood before the bar. Rodriguez and Thompson, once witnesses, were now defendants, indicted for perjury and concealment. The police department that shielded Coleman was placed under federal oversight. Every patrol was required to keep body cameras running and data backed up in duplicate. No one could ever claim lost evidence again. Police academies were ordered to teach citizen dignity and unconscious bias, authored by Justice Morgan. Standing at the lectern, robe draped across her shoulders, her voice rang deep and resolute. Never forget, a slap does not land only on one face. It lands on the Constitution itself. Young eyes looked up at her, glowing as though receiving an oath for their generation. She had not only reformed a system, she had become its symbol. The photograph of Justice stepping into court in her black robe, with a bruise on her cheek, and the gavel engraved "Truth will rise" in hand, spread nationwide. They called that moment the awakening hour. Law schools hung the image in lecture halls, churches placed it beside Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks, while small law offices in black communities printed it into posters with the caption, "Justice has a face, Kong Lee Kagung Mat." 12- and 13-year-old girls wrote letters to her. "I want to be a judge like you, so no one dares to dismiss me because of my skin." On Justice's face, the bruise had faded, leaving only a faint shadow like a scar. She never concealed it. Each morning, as she looked in the mirror, she touched it as if touching an oath. Her clerk, Janet, once asked, "Do you ever wish that day had never happened?" Justice smiled faintly, gazing out the window. "No, because sometimes, to wake a sleeping system, justice must bear a wound." At year's end, hundreds gathered in the central square for a commemoration. Mothers who had lost sons, men newly freed, young lawyers hungry for change, all stood, eyes lifted to the platform where Justice Morgan appeared. Her black robe billowed in the breeze as she looked down, her voice slow but charged. "We cannot erase the past. We cannot reclaim the stolen years, but we can turn pain into a foundation. The day I was called an animal, I thought my dignity was stolen. But that day I learned, dignity is not a privilege. It is a right, and no one can take it unless we let them." Applause thundered, not as passing noise, but as the steady heartbeat of hundreds finding healing. Weeks later, the county courthouse was officially renamed Justice Morgan Courthouse. On the stone wall where she had once been slammed down, a small plaque was affixed, etched forever. Here, justice was humiliated. Here, justice rose, and from here, justice will never fall again. At the dedication, Justice laid her hand upon the plaque, her eyes glistening yet proud. She turned back, thousands waiting in silence, and her voice rang out like a gavel carving history. Dignity is never a commodity to be bargained. It is a birthright, and justice, once awakened, will never sleep again. The applause erupted. On every face, pride and faith shone. In that moment, Justice Morgan was not just a judge. She was memory, symbol, and flame, a fire a whole generation would carry forward.